I want to tell you about a conversation that has haunted me for decades, a dialogue I created between two brothers that reveals something so disturbing about human nature that readers still debate whether I was describing reality or descending into nihilism. Ivan Karamazov asks his younger brother Alyosha a question that cuts to the heart of everything we believe about goodness and God and the structure of the universe. He describes the torture of children in excruciating detail, not fiction but real cases he's collected. And then he says if the harmony of the universe requires even one child's suffering, he rejects it. He hands back his ticket to paradise. He cannot accept a world built on such a foundation. And through Ivan's rebellion, I was exploring something that tormented me my entire life. The problem of evil, not evil as abstraction, not sin as theological category, but actual concrete evil. The kind that makes your stomach turn, the kind that shatters comfortable philosophies, the kind that forces you to look directly at what human beings are capable of doing to each other and ask how this is possible, why this exists, what it means about the nature of humanity and the nature of existence itself. Because here's what I discovered through my own life and through creating characters who embody different aspects of this darkness. Evil is not what most people think it is. It's not the opposite of good in some simple dualistic framework. It's not the absence of knowledge or the result of ignorance. It's not something external that corrupts otherwise innocent beings. Evil is woven into the fabric of human nature itself. It exists in potential in every human heart, including yours, including mine, and the capacity for terrible acts lives alongside the capacity for tremendous love, sometimes in the same person, sometimes in the same moment. And understanding this doesn't excuse evil, doesn't justify it, doesn't make it acceptable, but it does force us to abandon our comfortable illusions about human nature and face something much more complex and much more disturbing. When I was sent to Siberia at 28 years old, when I lived for 4 years among murderers and thieves and violent criminals, I expected to find monsters. I expected to encounter people fundamentally different from myself, people whose nature was corrupt in ways mine was not, and what I found instead shook the foundations of everything I believed about humanity. These men who had committed terrible acts, who had killed without remorse, who had destroyed lives without hesitation, they were not monsters, they were human, fully human, and in their humanity I recognized myself, recognized the same impulses, the same capacity, the same potential that existed in me existed in them. The only difference was that they had crossed lines I had not crossed, had acted on impulses I had only felt, had descended into darkness I had only glimpsed. And this recognition was terrifying, because it meant that the distance between me and a murderer was not as vast as I wanted to believe, that the capacity for evil was not something alien to my nature but something intrinsic to it, that under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, with the wrong choices, I too could become what they had become. This is what I explored through my novels, through characters who commit terrible acts not because they're inhuman, but because they're too human, because they follow certain ideas to their logical conclusions, because they believe their intelligence places them above moral law, because they convince themselves that the ends justify the means, because they see suffering, and instead of responding with compassion, they respond with ideology. Raskolnikov murders an old woman because his theory tells him that extraordinary people have the right to transgress, that one worthless life can be sacrificed for the greater good, and his theory is sophisticated, is intellectually defensible, is based on real philosophical traditions, and it leads directly to murder, directly to blood, directly to the destruction of his own soul. Stavrogin in Demons commits acts so vile that I couldn't even describe them fully in the published version. Had to cut the chapter where he confesses because the publishers said it was too disturbing. And what makes Stavrogin truly terrifying is not that he's a monster, but that he's empty. He's capable of anything because he believes in nothing. He's crossed every moral boundary not out of passion, but out of boredom, out of a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, and his evil is cold, is calculated, is the result of nihilism taken to its ultimate conclusion. And through these characters I was asking what happens when you remove God from the universe, what happens when you abandon traditional morality. What happens when you convince yourself that you're above the rules that govern ordinary people? What happens when intelligence divorces itself from conscience? And the answer I discovered was evil, not metaphysical evil, not supernatural evil, but human evil, the kind that emerges from ideas, from philosophies, from the conviction that you know better than centuries of moral wisdom. Ivan Karamazov articulates the problem brilliantly. He cannot accept a God who permits the suffering of innocents, cannot reconcile divine love with the reality of children being tortured, and his rebellion is intellectually powerful, is emotionally compelling, is based on genuine moral outrage at real suffering. But watch what happens when you follow Ivan's logic to its conclusion. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. If there is no divine authority, then morality becomes subjective, becomes whatever we decide it should be, becomes a matter of opinion rather than truth. And once morality is subjective, then there is no foundation for saying that anything is truly wrong, that any act is truly evil, that any boundary should not be crossed. Smerdyakov, the illegitimate brother, listens to Ivan's sophisticated philosophy and draws the practical conclusion. He murders their father. And when Ivan confronts him, Smerdyakov says calmly, logically, "You taught me this. You said if there is no God, everything is permitted. You gave me the philosophy. I simply acted on it. I am your student, your creation, your logical conclusion." And Ivan goes mad, cannot bear the weight of what his ideas have produced, cannot accept that his intellectual rebellion against God has resulted in actual murder, actual evil, actual blood. And his madness is the recognition that ideas have consequences, that philosophy is not abstract, that what we believe shapes what we do, that intellectual positions have moral implications whether we acknowledge them or not. This is what I understood about evil through my own experience, and through creating these characters. Evil is often not the result of ignorance, but of ideas, not the product of stupidity, but of intelligence misapplied, not the absence of philosophy, but philosophy taken to dangerous conclusions, not the lack of sophistication, but sophistication divorced from wisdom. The most terrible acts in history have been committed not by people who didn't think, but by people who thought too much in the wrong direction, who developed elaborate justifications for cruelty, who created sophisticated ideologies to excuse oppression, who built intellectual frameworks to rationalize murder. And here's what's crucial to understand: the people who commit these acts rarely see themselves as evil, rarely think they're doing wrong. They almost always have reasons, have justifications, have arguments for why their actions are necessary, are justified, are even good when properly understood. Raskolnikov doesn't see himself as a common murderer. He sees himself as someone willing to transgress for the greater good, someone strong enough to bear the burden of necessary evil, someone who understands that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and his self-image is as someone heroic, not villainous, someone who has the courage to do what others are too weak to do. This is the seductive nature of evil. It doesn't announce itself as evil. It presents itself as necessity, as justice, as the hard truth that weak people cannot face, as the price that must be paid for progress, as the sacrifice required for the greater good. And the person committing evil acts can maintain their self-image as good, as moral, as even heroic, because they've accepted the logic that justifies their actions. And this is why philosophy matters, why ideas matter, why what we believe about human nature and morality and the structure of existence has real consequences, because the ideas we accept shape the actions we take. The philosophies we embrace determine the boundaries we recognize. The worldviews we adopt influence the kind of people we become. I watched this process in Siberia, watched how men who had committed terrible acts would justify themselves, would explain why their violence was understandable, why their victims deserved what happened, why they had no choice, why anyone in their position would have done the same. And they weren't lying, weren't consciously deceiving themselves. They genuinely believed their justifications, had constructed narratives that made their actions make sense, had found ways to preserve their self-image as decent people who happened to do terrible things for good reasons. And I realized that this is how evil works in ordinary people, not through embracing wickedness, but through accepting justifications, not through choosing darkness, but through redefining what darkness means, not through becoming monsters, but through finding reasons why monstrous acts are acceptable. But there's another kind of evil I explored, a kind that's even more disturbing because it lacks even the justification of ideology, lacks even the excuse of believing you're serving some higher purpose, and that's the evil that comes from emptiness, from the absence of meaning, from the void where values should be. Stavrogin represents this. He's not driven by ideology, not motivated by theory, not serving any cause or pursuing any goal. He commits terrible acts because he feels nothing, because he's searching for something that will make him feel alive, because his nihilism is so complete that he cannot distinguish between good and evil, cannot see why one action is better than another, cannot find any reason not to do whatever occurs to him. And this emptiness is more terrifying than ideology because you can argue with ideas, can challenge philosophies, can expose the flaws in reasoning. But how do you argue with someone who doesn't care about arguments, who sees all values as arbitrary, who recognizes no authority, who believes in nothing? Stavrogin's confession, the chapter that was cut from the published version, describes him calmly, coldly, almost curiously violating a child. And what makes it unbearable is not passion, not rage, not even hatred, but detachment, clinical observation, the attitude of someone conducting an experiment. And this reveals something about evil that ideology cannot explain, that some acts emerge not from wrong beliefs, but from the absence of belief, not from choosing the wrong values, but from recognizing no values at all. Father Zosima, the wise elder in the Brothers Karamazov, says something that stayed with me. He says that hell is the suffering of being unable to love, that the worst torment is not physical pain but spiritual emptiness, not external punishment but internal death. And this captures something essential about evil, that its ultimate form is not active wickedness but the death of the capacity for connection, for compassion, for love, for anything that makes us human. And I saw this in some of the men in Siberia, saw that the worst criminals were not the ones consumed by rage or driven by desperation, but the ones who felt nothing, whose eyes were dead, who had killed not in passion but in indifference, and they were already in hell, were already experiencing the torment of complete spiritual death, even while their bodies continued to function. So here's what I discovered about evil through my life and work. It exists in multiple forms, emerges from different sources, manifests through various mechanisms, but at its core it always involves a betrayal of human nature, a violation of what we're meant to be, a descent into something less than human even when it presents itself as something more. The ideological evil of Raskolnikov betrays humanity by placing abstract theory above concrete compassion, by valuing ideas more than people, by sacrificing the particular for the universal, by forgetting that real human beings are always more important than any system or philosophy or ideology. The nihilistic evil of Stavrogin betrays humanity by abandoning all values, all meaning, all connection, by reducing life to meaningless occurrence, by seeing people as objects rather than subjects, by living in such complete detachment that nothing matters, nothing means anything, nothing has value beyond his own momentary curiosity. And between these extremes are countless variations, countless ways that human beings betray their own nature, violate their own humanity, descend into darkness while telling themselves they're pursuing light, commit terrible acts while maintaining the belief that they're good people, destroy others while preserving their own self-image as moral actors. But here's what's crucial, and this is what distinguishes my understanding of evil from simpler moral frameworks. Acknowledging this capacity for evil in human nature is not the same as excusing it. Recognizing that evil emerges from within humanity, rather than from outside, it doesn't mean accepting it or minimizing it or treating it as inevitable. In fact, understanding the sources of evil is the first step toward resisting it, toward recognizing when we're moving in dangerous directions, toward catching ourselves before we cross lines that cannot be uncrossed, toward maintaining our humanity against the forces both internal and external that would corrupt it. Alyosha represents this resistance, this refusal to accept either Ivan's intellectual rebellion or Stavrogin's nihilistic emptiness, this insistence that love is possible, that goodness is real, that meaning exists despite all the suffering and evil in the world. And his response to Ivan's catalogue of horrors is not an argument, not a philosophical refutation, not a theoretical defense of God, but an action. He gets up and kisses his brother, offers compassion instead of logic, gives love instead of explanation, and this is the only adequate response to evil, not matching it with counter-evil, not answering violence with violence, not responding to hatred with hatred, but maintaining your humanity, insisting on love, refusing to let evil corrupt your own nature even when fighting against it. This is what I learned in Siberia, that the men who survived with their humanity intact were not the ones who became like their oppressors, not the ones who adopted the brutality of the system, not the ones who let their suffering turn them into monsters, but the ones who maintained their capacity for compassion, for kindness, for love even in hell, the ones who shared their bread when they had almost nothing, who showed mercy when they had every reason for bitterness, who remained human when everything in their environment pushed them toward becoming less than human. And Father Zosima's teaching captures this. He says we are all responsible for all, that every person's sin affects everyone else, that we cannot separate ourselves from humanity's darkness, cannot claim to be uninvolved in the evil of the world, cannot pretend that we're fundamentally different from those who commit terrible acts. This responsibility for all means recognizing that the capacity for evil in others exists in you, that the acts you condemn are acts you're capable of under different circumstances, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, including your own, and this recognition should not lead to moral relativism, should not result in the conclusion that nothing is really wrong because everyone is capable of everything, but should lead to humility, to compassion, to the understanding that judging others is easy, but facing your own darkness is the real challenge. When I look at Raskolnikov or Stavrogin, or any of the characters who commit terrible acts in my novels, I'm not looking at people fundamentally different from myself. I'm looking at possibilities I contain, at paths I could have taken, at versions of myself that emerged when I followed certain ideas to their conclusions, when I removed certain constraints, when I allowed certain aspects of my nature to dominate others. And this is what makes evil truly terrifying, not that it's alien to human nature, but that it's intrinsic to it, not that it comes from outside, but that it emerges from within, not that it's the result of corruption of an originally pure nature, but that it's a potential we all carry, a darkness we all contain, a capacity we all possess whether we acknowledge it or not. But acknowledging this darkness is not the same as embracing it. Recognizing this capacity is not the same as acting on it. Understanding that we're capable of evil is actually the first defense against committing it, because the people most likely to do terrible things are the ones who believe they're incapable of them, who trust their own goodness absolutely, who never question their motives or examine their actions or consider that they might be wrong. The underground man says something revealing. He says he's capable of every vileness, that he contains all possible contradictions, that he could be noble or base, generous or cruel, loving or hateful depending on circumstances, and this self-awareness, this recognition of his own complexity and capacity for evil, is actually what keeps him from committing the worst acts, because he doesn't trust himself, doesn't believe in his own absolute goodness, doesn't assume that his impulses are always right or his judgments always correct. And there's wisdom in this distrust, in this recognition that we're all capable of terrible things, that the boundaries between good and evil are not as clear as we'd like them to be, that maintaining our humanity requires constant vigilance, constant examination, constant questioning of our own motives and justifications, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. So when you encounter evil, when you see terrible acts committed, when you witness cruelty or violence or oppression, the question is not just how could they do this, what's wrong with them, how are they different from me? The question is also how am I capable of this? What in my own nature could lead to similar acts? What justifications might I accept? What circumstances might push me in that direction? What ideas might I embrace that would make terrible things seem necessary or justified or even good? And this self-examination is not morbid, is not self-flagellation, is not assuming you're guilty of things you haven't done. It's honest recognition that the capacity for evil exists in all of us, that we're all capable of betraying our own humanity, that we all contain darkness alongside light, cruelty alongside compassion, the capacity to destroy alongside the capacity to love. Father Zosima teaches that we must ask forgiveness from all for all, must recognize our participation in the world's evil, must acknowledge that we're not separate from humanity's darkness, and this is not because we're directly responsible for every evil act, but because we participate in the human condition, share the nature that makes evil possible, benefit from systems built on exploitation, contribute to cultures that enable cruelty, maintain our comfort through the suffering of others, whether we acknowledge it or not. And this recognition should lead not to despair but to compassion, not to guilt that paralyzes but to responsibility that motivates, not to the conclusion that we're all equally evil so nothing matters, but to the understanding that we're all capable of evil so everything matters, every choice matters, every action matters, every moment of choosing good over evil, love over hatred, compassion over cruelty matters because we're not predetermined, are not destined, are not locked into any particular path. The existence of evil in human nature doesn't mean evil is inevitable. The capacity for terrible acts doesn't mean we must commit them. The potential for darkness doesn't determine that we'll embrace it, because alongside the capacity for evil exists the capacity for good. Alongside the potential for cruelty exists the potential for compassion. Alongside the darkness exists the light, and which we choose, which we cultivate, which we allow to dominate our nature is up to us, is a decision we make continually, is a choice we face in every moment. This is what Ivan ultimately cannot accept, cannot reconcile, that both exist simultaneously, that the universe contains both terrible suffering and tremendous love, that human nature includes both capacity for evil and capacity for good, that life is not simple, is not reducible to comfortable categories, is not explicable through any single philosophy or theology or ideology. And his madness comes from trying to force reality into a framework it won't fit, trying to make the universe conform to his moral demands, trying to reconcile what cannot be reconciled through logic alone. And Alyosha's response, his kiss, his love, his refusal to abandon faith despite all the suffering Ivan has shown him, is not an answer to Ivan's questions but a different way of being, a different response to the same reality. A choice to love despite evil rather than reject love because of evil. So here's what I'm offering you, what I discovered through my life and work and suffering. Evil is real, is terrible, is woven into human nature, exists as potential in every heart including yours, emerges from ideas and emptiness and the betrayal of our own humanity. And understanding this is the first step toward resisting it, toward maintaining your humanity in a world that constantly threatens to corrupt it, toward choosing love in the face of hatred, compassion in the face of cruelty, hope in the face of despair. This understanding doesn't make evil less terrible, doesn't excuse it, doesn't minimize the suffering it causes, but it does make it comprehensible, makes it something we can recognize in ourselves before it manifests in action, makes it something we can resist rather than something we simply condemn in others while remaining blind to it in ourselves. And the path forward is not through denying evil, not through pretending humans are better than they are, not through comfortable illusions about human nature, but through honest recognition of what we're capable of combined with determined commitment to becoming something better, to choosing our highest nature over our lowest, to cultivating compassion over cruelty, to maintaining our humanity against all the forces that would corrupt.